The chains sang against stone as Jasmine collapsed to her knees, the iron biting into wrists already rubbed raw. Above her, the wolf's head carved into the throne seemed to snarl through the torchlight, its granite fangs frozen mid-strike. Behind those stone jaws sat the man who wore her father's crown, bare-chested, broad-shouldered, his dark hair falling past shoulders built for war. Jaffa didn't even flinch when she spat blood onto the floor between them. "I will not be your bride," Jasmine hissed, forcing the words through cracked lips. Her blonde hair hung in matted tangles, filthy with dungeon grime, but her eyes burned with something far more dangerous than rage. "Not in this life. Not in the next. Not if you carve my heart from my chest and wear it as a trophy." The throne room fell silent. Even the torches seemed to hold their breath. Jaffar's expression never changed. He simply raised 2 fingers, a gesture so casual it made her stomach turn. From the shadows behind the wolf throne emerged a figure in crimson robes, his face hidden beneath a deep hood. The fabric whispered across stone like something alive. "Malika." The name tasted like ash in her mouth. "My lord." The sorcerer's voice was soft, almost gentle. It made her skin crawl. "She has made her choice clear," Jaffa said, his tone carrying the same indifference he might use to discuss the weather. "Proceed." Jasmine jerked backward, chains rattling. "What?" Malika's hand shot out, pale fingers splayed wide as they pressed against her forehead. The touch was ice. The cold drove through her skull like iron spikes, and suddenly the throne room began to dissolve. Silver smoke curled at the edges of her vision, eating away at the stone walls, at the watching faces of Jaffar's soldiers, at the wolf's frozen snarl. She tried to scream, but the sound caught in her throat as memories began to unravel like thread pulled from fabric. Her father's face disappeared first, his kind eyes, his booming laugh, the way he'd called her little lioness. Gone. The gardens where she'd played as a child evaporated into mist. Her mother's lullabies turned to static, then silence. Her own name, Jasmine, Princess Jasmine, daughter of nothing. The void swallowed everything. Her hatred. Her grief. Her vow of vengeance. Every moment that had made her her was stripped away, leaving only a terrible, aching emptiness. She was aware of her body hitting the cold floor, aware of strong arms lifting her, but these sensations felt distant, unimportant. Unconnected to whoever this hollow thing was. When her eyes finally opened again, they were vacant. Wide and blue and utterly empty. Jasmine woke to softness. It was wrong somehow, this sensation of silk against her skin, the way the sheets whispered when she moved. Everything felt muffled, distant, as though she were experiencing the world from underwater. She blinked at the canopy above her, its dark fabric embroidered with silver thread that caught the morning light filtering through tall windows. The patterns meant nothing to her. Everything meant nothing. Her hands trembled as she lifted them, studying her own fingers as if they belonged to someone else. There were faint marks around her wrists, bruises in the shape of shackles, purple-yellow and tender. She touched them gently, and a flash of something cold shot through her mind. Stone floors. Screaming. Then nothing again. The door opened without warning. He filled the doorway completely. Tall, powerfully built, his dark hair loose around his shoulders. He wore a simple tunic now, but authority radiated from him like heat from a forge. When he smiled, it didn't quite reach his eyes. "You're awake," he said, his voice carrying warmth that felt rehearsed. "Thank the gods. I was beginning to worry." Jasmine pulled the sheets higher, instinct driving modesty even when memory failed. Who are you?" He crossed the room with measured steps, sitting on the edge of the bed with careful deliberation. "My name is Jaffa. I am your betrothed." He reached for her hand, and she let him take it, too confused to resist. "And you, my darling, have been through an ordeal." "I don't remember." The words came out small, frightened. "I don't remember anything." "The rebels," Jaffa said softly, his thumb stroking across her bruised wrist with false tenderness. "They attacked during the festival. You were their prize. They wanted to use you against me, against the kingdom." His jaw tightened, a performance of controlled rage. "My men found you in their camp. You'd been mistreated. The trauma, the head wound, the healers said memory loss was possible. She wanted to believe him. There was nothing else to believe in. The emptiness inside her was so vast, so hungry for anything to fill it, that his words felt like anchors in a storm. "The marks on my wrists." "Restraints," he said, and his expression darkened. "The rebels are animals. They bound you with iron chains." He lifted her hand to his lips, kissing the bruised skin gently. "But you're safe now. Here with me, in the Black Raven Fortress. No one will ever hurt you again." The fortress. The name should have meant something. Instead, it was just another empty word in an empty mind. "Why can't I remember you?" she whispered, searching his face for anything familiar. "If we're to be married, shouldn't I?" "Love cannot be destroyed," Jaffer interrupted, his grip tightening just slightly. "It lives deeper than memory. You'll feel it again, in time. I promise you that." He stood, straightening his tunic with practiced ease. "Rest now. Heal. And know that I will protect you from everything that threatens us." He left her alone with the silk sheets and the silver-threaded canopy and the terrible certainty that something vital had been carved out of her. But she couldn't name what was missing, and that was the most frightening thing of all. The days bled together like watercolors in rain. Jasmine learned to walk the corridors of the Black Raven Fortress with her head held high, her gown trailing behind her like a ghost. Servants bowed as she passed, their eyes never quite meeting hers. She wore silk and velvet now, deep crimsons and midnight blues that made her pale hair gleam like moonlight. Jaffer had commissioned jewelry for her. Silver chains that wrapped around her throat, delicate as spider webs. Beautiful cages for a beautiful bird. She tried to be grateful. The fortress was magnificent in its severity, all black stone and soaring arches, tapestries depicting battles she couldn't remember and victories that meant nothing. Jaffer gave her everything, a library filled with books she couldn't concentrate on, gardens where winter roses bloomed in defiance of the season, musicians who played while she took her meals alone in the great hall. He was often gone, managing the kingdom, keeping the rebels at bay. Protecting her, he said. She should have felt safe. Instead, she felt like porcelain, smooth and cold and hollow, waiting to shatter. The dreams started 3 weeks after she woke. Always the same. She stood in a garden thick with lilies, their white petals luminous in moonlight. The air smelled sweet, almost cloying. Then the wolf emerged from the darkness. Massive, its fur black as pitch, its eyes burning gold. It moved with terrifying grace, circling the lilies until it chose the largest bloom. Its jaws opened. The lily disappeared in one savage bite, stems snapping, petals scattering like snow. Then it looked at her. And smiled. Jasmine woke gasping, tangled in silk sheets, her heart hammering against her ribs. The room was dark. Empty. But the scent of lilies lingered, impossible and wrong. She began to see the wolf everywhere. In the carved throne where Jaffer held court. In the shadows that stretched too long across the fortress floors. In the way his soldiers moved, pack animals circling prey. She mentioned the dreams once, carefully, over dinner. Jaffer's expression darkened. "Lilies," he said slowly, setting down his wine. "The rebels used them as symbols. They must have shown you their propaganda before my men rescued you." He reached across the table, covering her hand with his. "These nightmares are the trauma trying to surface. You must push them away, my darling. Focus on our future, not their poison." But that night, the dream came again. The wolf. The lilies. The savage, methodical destruction of something pure and white. And when the beast turned to face her, she saw something in its burning eyes that made her blood run cold. Recognition. She began wearing high collars to hide the way her pulse jumped whenever Jaffer touched her. She smiled when he kissed her forehead, when he spoke of wedding dates and coronations. She played the part of the porcelain queen, beautiful, fragile, grateful. But in the dark alone, she pressed her hands against her temples and whispered to the emptiness inside her skull, "What did I forget? What did you take from me?" The void never answered. But the wolf kept smiling in her dreams. The morning was cold enough to see her breath, and Jasmine had taken to walking the ramparts when the fortress felt too close, too suffocating. Up here, with the wind tearing at her cloak and the sky stretching endlessly gray above her, She could almost pretend she was something other than a beautiful ornament in Jaffar's collection. The stones beneath her feet were worn smooth by centuries of soldiers' boots. She trailed her fingers along the battlements, letting the rough granite ground her in the present. Below, the courtyard sprawled out like a chessboard, servants moving between buildings, guards drilling in formation, smoke rising from the kitchens. Everything ordered. Everything controlled. Then she heard the crack of leather against flesh. Jasmine stopped, her hand frozen on the cold stone. The sound came again, sharp, brutal, followed by a choked cry. She moved to the edge of the rampart and looked down. In the courtyard, a man was bound to a post. His back was already striped red, his head hanging forward as a guard raised the whip again. The leather sang through the air and bit into skin, and blood, bright arterial red, splashed across the pale stones. The world tilted. Jasmine's vision blurred at the edges, and suddenly she wasn't on the ramparts anymore. She was somewhere else, somewhere that smelled of summer roses and iron. A courtyard she knew, though she couldn't name it. Sunlight too bright. A crowd pressed close, their faces twisted with fear and fascination. And a man kneeling before a block of wood worn dark with old stains. He had kind eyes. Laugh lines at their corners. His hair was going grey at the temples, and he wore robes of deep blue embroidered with something. Lilies. White lilies across his chest. He looked up, and his gaze found hers in the crowd, and his mouth moved, forming words she couldn't hear but somehow knew. Be strong, little lioness. The axe fell. Blood sprayed across the white lilies, turning them crimson. The crowd roared or screamed or maybe both, and someone was dragging her backward, their hands like iron on her arms, and she was screaming his name. My lady. Jasmine gasped, the rampart snapping back into focus around her. A guard stood 3 feet away, his expression carefully neutral. Are you unwell? You cried out. Her hands were gripping the battlements so hard her knuckles had gone white. Her face was wet. When had she started crying? I'm fine, she managed, though her voice shook. The man below. Why is he being punished? The guard glanced over the edge, disinterested. Theft, my lady. He stole bread from the kitchens. Lord Jaffar's law is absolute. Lord Jaffar's law. The words should have sounded reassuring. Instead, they felt like a noose tightening. The man I saw, Jasmine whispered, more to herself than the guard. The one who, but the image was already fading, dissolving like mist in sunlight. She grasped for it desperately. Blue robes. Lilies. Kind eyes. Little lioness. Who was he? My lady. Nothing. She pulled her cloak tighter, suddenly freezing despite the thick wool. Nothing. I'm tired. I should rest. But she couldn't rest. That night, she lay awake staring at the canopy, tracing the silver embroidery with her eyes, and tried to remember the color of the dead man's eyes. Tried to remember why the word father kept echoing in the hollow spaces of her mind like a prayer to a god whose name she'd forgotten. In the morning, there were lilies on her breakfast tray. White ones fresh cut, their stems still weeping sap. Jaffar smiled at her across the table. I thought they might brighten your day, he said. Jasmine looked at the flowers and felt her stomach turn. But she smiled back, porcelain perfect, and said, Thank you, my lord. They're beautiful. Jasmine wasn't supposed to be in the western tower. Jaffar had told her it was dangerous. Old stone, unstable floors, places where a lady might fall and hurt herself. But after the incident on the ramparts, after 3 nights of dreaming about blue robes stained red, she found herself drawn to the forbidden spaces of the fortress. As if her body remembered paths her mind couldn't. The door at the top of the spiral stairs was unlocked. That should have been her first warning. Inside, the chamber was circular, its walls lined with shelves that stretched to the vaulted ceiling. But these weren't books. Glass jars caught the afternoon light filtering through a narrow window, hundreds of them, each filled with something that moved like smoke or mist or liquid silver. Some glowed faintly. Others seemed to pulse with their own rhythm, as if breathing. The air tasted like ozone and copper. Like the moment before lightning strikes. Jasmine stepped forward, her slippers silent on the stone floor. Each jar was labeled in script so small she had to squint to read it. Loyalty, fear, devotion, rage. The words meant nothing and everything. She moved along the shelves, fingers trailing close to the glass but not quite touching, until she reached a section where the jars were larger, their contents darker. One jar sat alone on a pedestal in the center of the room. It was beautiful in a terrible way, cut crystal that fractured the light into rainbow shards, filled with smoke that churned and twisted like a storm trapped in glass. No label. But as Jasmine approached, she felt something pull tight in her chest, a recognition that bypassed thought entirely. Her hand reached out before she could stop herself. The moment her fingers touched the crystal, the world exploded into sound. I will not be your bride. Her own voice, raw with fury and defiance, screaming words that tore through the emptiness in her skull like shrapnel. The smoke inside the jar writhed violently, and suddenly she could see images flickering in its depths, fragmented, chaotic, real. A throne room. The wolf's head carved in granite. A man in crimson robes reaching for her face. Cold spreading through her mind like ice water. And her voice over and over, a litany of rage. Not in this life. Not in the next. I am Jasmine, daughter of King Aldric, last of the blood of. The jar shattered. Jasmine stumbled backward, her palm sliced open by crystal shards, blood dripping onto the stone floor. The smoke that had been trapped inside billowed out, dissipating into nothing, and with it went the voices, the images, everything. She was left gasping, her heart hammering so hard it hurt, staring at the broken glass glittering like stars. What have you done? Malika stood in the doorway, his crimson robes seeming to drink the light. His face was no longer hidden by his hood, pale, gaunt, with eyes like chips of amber. He looked at the shattered jar, at the blood on her hand, and something flickered across his expression. Fear, maybe. Or calculation. You shouldn't be here, he said softly, moving into the room with careful steps. This chamber is forbidden for good reason. That was my voice. Jasmine's words came out barely above a whisper. In that jar. That was me. Memories can be treacherous things, Malika replied, and now he was circling her the way the wolf circled the lilies in her dreams. Sometimes they're better left contained. I said I wouldn't be his bride. The words felt like broken glass in her mouth. I said my father's name. King Aldric. She looked up at the sorcerer, and for the first time since waking in silk sheets, she felt something other than confusion. She felt fury. What did you do to me? Malika's hand moved to his belt, where something glinted silver. A blade? A talisman? You should return to your chambers, my lady. Lord Jaffa will be displeased if he finds you've injured yourself. But Jasmine didn't move. She stood among the broken crystal and the fading smoke, her bleeding hand clenched into a fist, and stared at the hundreds of jars lining the walls. Each one a stolen piece of someone's soul. Each one a crime written in glass and mist. How many? She asked. How many people have you done this to? The sorcerer smiled, and it was the wolf's smile, predatory and patient. As many as my lord requires. Jaffa had been surprisingly accommodating when she asked to visit the city. Of course, my darling, he'd said, though his eyes held that calculating gleam she'd learned to fear. Fresh air will do you good. But take the guards. The rebels still prowl the streets. So Jasmine descended into the lower city surrounded by 6 armed men, their hands never far from their sword hilts. The marketplace sprawled before them, a maze of stalls selling spices and fabrics, the air thick with smoke from cooking fires and the press of bodies. She'd hoped the chaos would feel liberating after weeks of the fortress's suffocating order. Instead, it felt like walking through a graveyard. The people didn't meet her eyes. When she passed, conversations died. Mothers pulled their children closer. An old woman spat on the ground after Jasmine's entourage moved by, the gesture small but deliberate. They hated her. Or feared her. Or both. My lady, perhaps we should return, one of the guards suggested as they entered a narrow alley between stone buildings. The passage was shadowed, cool, empty except for a few beggars huddled against the walls. This area isn't safe. But Jasmine kept walking, drawn by something she couldn't name. The alley opened into a small courtyard where a fountain stood dry, its basin cracked and filled with dead leaves. She approached it slowly, her fingers trailing along the worn stone edge, and felt that pull again, the same recognition that had led her to Malika's chamber. Nightingale. The word was barely a breath, spoken from somewhere behind her. Jasmine spun, her heart lurching, but saw only shadows and her guards scanning the courtyard with professional wariness. "Who said that?" she demanded. The guards exchanged glances. "My lady." Someone spoke. "I heard," but the word was already fading, slipping through her fingers like smoke. What had she heard? Then she saw him. A figure in a hooded cloak, half hidden in a doorway across the courtyard. Too far for her guards to notice, close enough for her to see the glint of his eyes beneath the hood. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and when he moved his hand in a subtle gesture, 2 fingers crossed over his heart. Something in Jasmine's chest cracked wide open. Nightingale. The word detonated in her mind like a bomb. She was running through corridors, her lungs burning, her father's voice echoing behind her. "If anything happens, find Cashin. The nightingale knows the song." She was 10 years old and learning codes, secret phrases that meant safety and ally and run. She was 16 and watching a general kneel before her father's throne, his voice steady as he swore an oath. "I am your nightingale, your majesty. I will sing only for the crown." She was screaming as soldiers dragged her through blood-soaked halls, and the general, Cashin, his name was Cashin, fought 3 men to reach her before an arrow took him in the shoulder and, "My lady, are you unwell?" Jasmine realized she'd grabbed the fountain's edge for support, her knuckles white, her breathing ragged. The hooded figure was gone. Had he ever been there? Or was her mind finally, mercifully breaking apart? "I need to sit," she managed. But that night, alone in her chambers, she pressed her fists against her temples and whispered the word over and over like an incantation. "Nightingale. Nightingale. Nightingale." And with each repetition, the dam cracked wider. She remembered her father's study, all mahogany and leather-bound books. She remembered a woman singing lullabies. Her mother, gods, her mother. She remembered the weight of a training sword in her hand and the way Cashin had corrected her stance. "Higher, princess. A lioness doesn't cower." Princess. She was a princess. Not a rescued maiden. Not a grateful bride-to-be. She was Princess Jasmine, daughter of King Aldrich, and these people, Jaffa, Malika, every soldier wearing the wolf's insignia, they weren't her protectors. They were her captors. Jasmine stood and walked to the window, looking out over the fortress that had been her prison masquerading as a palace. Her reflection stared back at her in the glass, blonde hair loose around her shoulders, her throat circled by Jaffar's silver chains. But her eyes were different now. No longer vacant. They burned. "Cashin," she whispered to her reflection. "If you're alive, if you're out there, I remember. Not everything. Not yet. But enough." The wolf could smile all it wanted in her dreams. The lily had teeth of her own. Jasmine waited until the fortress slept. Until even the guards on the ramparts had grown drowsy with the late hour and the wine she'd arranged to have delivered to their posts. A lady's kindness, they'd thought. A future queen learning to care for her people. Fools. She moved through the corridors like a ghost, barefoot and silent, a kitchen knife hidden in the folds of her nightgown. The western tower's door stood open. Malika had grown careless after her first intrusion, perhaps believing her too broken to be dangerous. Or perhaps he simply didn't care. The ritual chamber glowed with the light of 100 captured souls. Malika stood at a table in the center, grinding something in a mortar with methodical precision. He didn't turn when she entered. "I wondered when you'd return," he said softly. "The mind is a resilient thing. It fights against emptiness. Seeks to fill the void with anything, even pain." "Where is it?" Jasmine's voice was steady, cold. "The rest of my memories. Where did you put them?" Now he turned, and his amber eyes gleamed with something almost like respect. "They're gone, princess. That jar you shattered held everything. When the glass broke, so did the spell's anchor. Those memories dissolved into nothing." "You're lying." "I have no reason to lie. You've already lost, Jasmine." He set down the mortar and turned to face her fully. Even if fragments return, you'll never be whole. You'll never be the girl who defied Jaffer in his throne room. That Jasmine died the moment I touched her brow. She pulled the knife free. Then I'll settle for vengeance. Malika laughed, a dry, brittle sound. With a kitchen blade? Child, I've survived assassination attempts from trained killers. You think? Jasmine lunged. She wasn't graceful, wasn't trained. But desperation made her fast, and fury made her vicious. The knife caught Malika's forearm as he raised it to block, and he gasped, stumbling backward into the shelves. Glass jars crashed to the floor, smoke billowing out in silver clouds. You little, he grabbed her wrist, twisting hard, and the knife clattered away. His other hand shot to her throat, squeezing, and Jasmine felt her vision start to blur. But her fingers found his face, nails raking across his eyes, and he screamed, releasing her. They fell together, grappling on the floor amid broken glass and escaping memories. Malika's hand found her hair, yanking her head back, and his other hand fumbled at his belt for the silver blade she'd seen before. But Jasmine's fingers closed around a shard of crystal from the shattered jars, and she drove it into his throat without hesitation. Blood sprayed hot across her face. Malika made a wet, choking sound, his hands going to his neck as crimson poured between his fingers. His eyes went wide, disbelieving, and then something in them fractured. The amber light died, replaced by spreading darkness, and his body convulsed once before going still. The chamber erupted. Every jar on every shelf shattered simultaneously, glass exploding outward in a glittering storm. The smoke that had been contained, hundreds of stolen memories, thousands of stolen moments, rushed out in a screaming torrent. It filled the room, filled Jasmine's lungs, and then it was inside her, flooding through the cracks in her mind like water through a broken dam. Her father's execution. Every second of it. The feel of hands dragging her away. Her mother's face, pale with sickness, dying in a bed that smelled of lavender and grief. Her childhood, years of it, birthday celebrations and riding lessons, and the way the sun felt on her face in the garden where she'd played with a wolfhound puppy named Smoke. The invasion. Jaffer's army at the gates. Her father's generals falling one by one. Cashan fighting his way to her side, blood on his sword, shouting for her to run. The throne room. Her final stand. Her final vow. And then the cold. Malika's hand. The void swallowing everything. Jasmine screamed. It was a sound torn from the deepest part of her soul, grief and rage and recognition all at once. She screamed until her throat was raw, her hands pressed against her temples as memory after memory crashed through her like waves against a cliff face, each one eroding away the fiction Jaffer had built. When the flood finally subsided, she was lying on the floor among broken glass and Malika's cooling corpse. Her face was wet with tears and blood, her nightgown soaked through. But her eyes were clear. She remembered everything. Every single thing. Jasmine pushed herself to her feet, swaying, and looked at her reflection in a shard of mirrored glass. The girl staring back at her was no longer the porcelain queen. She was Princess Jasmine, last of the blood of Aldrich, and the man sleeping in the fortress's master chamber had murdered everyone she'd ever loved. She smiled, and it was a terrible thing. Soon, she whispered to her reflection. Very soon. The hardest part was the smile. Jasmine practiced it in the mirror for hours after she'd cleaned Malika's blood from beneath her fingernails. Soft. Adoring. Empty enough to be believed but not so vacant that Jaffer would suspect the sorcerer's spell had broken. She curved her lips just so, let her eyes go slightly unfocused, and watched herself transform back into the hollow bride he'd created. Perfect. When the guards discovered Malika's body the next morning, his throat torn open, the ritual chamber destroyed, Jasmine was in the gardens, humming tunelessly as she scattered seeds for the ravens. Jaffer found her there, his face carved from stone. Did you hear? He asked, watching her carefully. Jasmine looked up, blinking with practiced confusion. Hear what, my lord? Malika is dead. Murdered in the night. She let her hand fly to her mouth, the picture of delicate horror. Oh gods! Who would do such a thing? Jaffer's eyes searched her face for long, terrible seconds. Then he pulled her into his arms, and Jasmine let herself be held, even as every fiber of her being screamed to reach for his throat. "The rebels, most likely," he murmured against her hair. "They grow bolder. But don't worry. I'll protect you. I'll always protect you." "I know you will," Jasmine whispered, and imagined driving a knife through his ribs. The days that followed were a special kind of torture. Jaffa, unsettled by his sorcerer's death, kept her close, closer than before. She took meals with him now, sat beside him during audiences, let him hold her hand while he dispensed his brutal justice. A farmer executed for hoarding grain. A merchant's tongue removed for speaking against wolf law. A child whipped for stealing. Jasmine watched it all with vacant eyes and screamed on the inside. At night, Jaffa came to her chambers. Not to take her, not yet, he said, not until the wedding blessed their union, but to hold her, to whisper promises against her skin. He traced the line of her jaw with fingers that had strangled her father's last loyal general. He kissed her forehead with lips that had smiled as her city burned. And Jasmine let him. She let him because she'd seen the guards that ringed the fortress, the locks on every door, the way his soldiers watched her now with renewed suspicion. She couldn't fight her way out. Couldn't run. The only path to freedom led through Jaffar's chest, and the only way to reach his chest was to make him believe she was still his perfect, broken bride. So she played the part. When he touched her cheek, she leaned into his palm and thought about his severed head mounted on the gates. When he spoke of their wedding, she smiled sweetly and imagined his blood soaking into white silk. When he kissed her neck, she sighed softly and pictured the light dying in his eyes. "You're different lately," he said one evening, his arm around her waist as they stood on the balcony overlooking the city. More at peace." "I'm learning to be happy," Jasmine replied, her voice honey-sweet. "You've been so patient with me, helping me heal. I think I'm finally ready to move forward. To be the wife you deserve." His grip tightened possessively. "The wedding, then? Soon?" "Yes," she breathed, turning in his arms to look up at him with wide, trusting eyes. "Soon. I want to be yours completely." Jaffa smiled, victorious, and bent to kiss her. Jasmine kissed him back, soft and yielding, while behind her eyes she counted the ways she knew to kill a man. Cashin had taught her 17 before the kingdom fell. She'd need only one. That night, alone in her chambers, she stood before the mirror and let the mask slip. The face that stared back was sharp with hatred, beautiful with violence. This was who she really was now, not the princess she'd been, not the hollow bride he'd made her, but something new. Something forged in blood and broken glass. A wolf in sheep's clothing. She smiled at her reflection, and this time it wasn't practiced. This time it was real, a predator's promise. "One more week," she whispered. "One more week of your hands on me. One more week of your lies. And then, my lord, my beloved, my captor, then I'll show you what it means to cage a lioness." Outside her window, ravens circled the fortress towers, their cries echoing through the night like harbingers of the slaughter to come. Jasmine went to bed still smiling. The cathedral was a monument to Jaffar's vanity. Black stone and crimson banners, the wolf's head emblazoned on every surface, torches burning with flames that cast dancing shadows across the assembled crowd. Lords and ladies who'd bent the knee to save their own throats. Generals who'd betrayed their oaths for gold and power. Servants who'd learned that survival meant silence. They watched as Jasmine walked down the aisle in a gown of white silk that trailed behind her like spilled milk. Her hair was woven with silver chains. Her throat circled with diamonds that caught the firelight. She looked like a virgin sacrifice dressed for slaughter, and in a way, she supposed she was. Just not the sacrifice Jaffa imagined. He stood before the altar in black and crimson, his hair pulled back to reveal the sharp planes of his face. Handsome, if you could forget the monster beneath the skin. When she reached him, he took her hand with a grip that was just slightly too tight, possession masquerading as tenderness. The officiant droned through the ceremony. Words about unity and devotion, about the forging of a new kingdom from the ashes of the old. Jasmine barely heard them. She was counting heartbeats. Counting the seconds until she could finally end this. "Do you, Jasmine, take this man as your husband to honor and obey, in this life and all lives to come?" She looked up at Jaffa. Let her eyes shine with tears that could be read as joy. "I do." His smile was triumphant, absolute. He'd won. Broken the last daughter of Aldrich and remade her into his perfect queen. When he kissed her, sealing their union, the crowd erupted into applause that sounded like thunder. Jasmine kissed him back and tasted ashes. The feast was endless. Course after course of rich food she couldn't eat, wine that flowed like rivers, musicians playing songs that made her teeth ache. Jaffer kept his hand on her thigh beneath the table, his thumb drawing circles against the silk of her gown. Claiming. Always claiming. "Are you happy, my queen?" he murmured in her ear. Deliriously she lied, and felt his breath catch with satisfaction. When the last toast was drunk and the last song played, Jaffer stood and pulled her to her feet. The crowd cheered again, knowing, leering, celebrating the final conquest of their lord's bride. Jasmine let him lead her from the hall, her hand docile in his, her smile never wavering. The bridal suite was a cage of luxury. Rose petals scattered across silk sheets. Candles burning with sickly sweet incense. Wine waiting in crystal decanters. Everything prepared for the consummation of Jaffer's ultimate victory. He closed the door behind them and turned to her with hunger in his eyes. "Finally," he said, reaching for the laces of her gown. "Finally, you're mine in every way." Jasmine caught his hands, stilling them. "Let me," she whispered, her voice breathy and nervous. "Let me undress for you. Pour yourself wine. Watch." Jaffer's smile turned wolfish, but he stepped back, already imagining the show. He moved to the table, his back to her for just a moment as he reached for the decanter. Jasmine's hand slipped beneath the mattress where she'd hidden Malaker's ritual dagger 3 days ago. The blade was silver, etched with symbols that had once stolen souls. Now it would take only one life. She pulled it free as Jaffer turned back to her, wine cup in hand. He froze when he saw the knife. Saw her face, no longer vacant, no longer adoring, but carved from pure hatred. "Jasmine." His voice held the first notes of uncertainty she'd ever heard from him. "Wrong," she said softly, advancing with the blade held steady. "My name is Princess Jasmine, daughter of King Aldrich, last of the blood you tried to extinguish." She watched understanding dawn in his eyes, watched the color drain from his face. "Surprise, husband." The spell broke. "I remember everything." Jaffer's hand went to his sword, but Jasmine was faster. She'd been planning this moment for weeks, rehearsing every movement in her mind. The wine cup fell from his grip, shattering on the floor as she drove the blade toward his chest. He caught her wrist, barely. His strength was terrifying, his fingers crushing bone, but Jasmine had rage where he had confidence. She brought her knee up hard between his legs, and when he doubled over, gasping, she twisted the blade free and struck again. This time, she didn't miss. The silver dagger punched through the gap in his ribs, sliding between bone with a sound like tearing silk. Jaffer's eyes went wide, his mouth opening in a soundless scream as blood bloomed across his wedding finery. "This is for my father," Jasmine hissed, twisting the blade. "For my mother. For every soul you crushed beneath your boot." She pulled the dagger free and stabbed again. And again. And again. By the time she stopped, her white gown was crimson, and Jaffer lay dead on the floor of his bridal suite, his blood soaking into the rose petals scattered across expensive carpet. Jasmine stood over him, breathing hard, the blade still clutched in her shaking hand. Outside, someone was pounding on the door. Guards, alerted by the sound of struggle. She had minutes, maybe less, before they broke through. She looked at her reflection in the mirror across the room, a bride drenched in her husband's blood, her eyes wild and alive and finally free. The lioness smiled. The guards broke through the door to find their king bleeding out on crimson-soaked carpet, but Jasmine was already gone. She'd slipped through the servants' passage behind the wardrobe, a secret exit she'd discovered weeks ago while playing the docile bride. The blade was still in her hand, Jaffer's blood still warm on her skin. She didn't run. She walked with terrible purpose through corridors she'd once ruled as a child, past tapestries that had hung in her father's time, now defaced with the wolf's insignia. Servants scattered at the sight of her, the blood-soaked bride moving like a ghost through the fortress. None tried to stop her. Perhaps they saw something in her eyes that made interference seem like suicide. The throne room doors stood open, as if waiting. Jasmine stepped inside, and the wolf's head carved in granite seemed to snarl down at her from its perch. She'd knelt before this throne in chains. Had her memories ripped away while courtiers watched. Had sworn she'd never be his bride. She'd lied about that last part. But only technically. My lady. A lieutenant burst through the doors behind her, sword drawn, a dozen soldiers at his back. Step away from the throne. Lord Jaffa is dead, Jasmine said simply, and the certainty in her voice made them falter. Your wolf king bled out in his bridal bed like the dog he was. The lieutenant's face went white. You killed every single thrust. She turned to face them fully, the ritual dagger gleaming silver in the torchlight. I made him remember first. Did you know that? Before the end, I held that blade to his throat and made him say their names. My father. My mother. General Cashin. Captain Theron. Lady Amara. Every face, every soul he butchered to take this throne. She moved toward the wolf throne, and the soldiers shifted uneasily, uncertain whether to attack a woman or flee from something that wore a woman's shape but burned with vengeance incarnate. He cried, Jasmine continued, her voice almost conversational. Your mighty warlord. He wept and begged and promised me kingdoms if I'd spare him. She reached the throne and ran her fingers along its carved wolfish snout. I told him I already had a kingdom. He stole it. And I wanted it back. The lieutenant raised his sword. Seize her. But Jasmine had already grabbed a torch from its sconce. She held it to the ancient tapestries that lined the walls. Her father's victories, her grandfather's glory, centuries of history that Jaffa had claimed as his own. The fabric caught immediately, flames racing up the walls with hungry enthusiasm. What are you doing? The lieutenant screamed, but his men were already backing toward the doors as smoke began to fill the chamber. Cleansing, Jasmine said. She touched the torch to the wolf throne itself, and the oil-treated wood ignited with a roar. Fire climbed the carved wolf's head, turning its snarl into a melting scream. This throne was built on blood. Let it return to ash. The soldiers fled. Smart men, choosing survival over loyalty to a dead king. Jasmine watched them go, then walked calmly toward the main doors as the throne room transformed into an inferno behind her. The heat was tremendous, the smoke choking, but she moved through it like she was immune to mortal concerns. The fortress bells began to ring. Alarm, chaos, the empire collapsing without its head. Jasmine emerged into the courtyard as the eastern sky began to lighten. Dawn, or as close to it as made no difference. Behind her, the throne room windows glowed orange, and she could hear the crash of falling timbers as the fire spread. Soon the entire fortress would burn. Good. Let it. Let every stone that remembered Jaffar's reign be reduced to rubble. A figure detached itself from the shadows near the gates. Tall, broad-shouldered, moving with military precision despite obvious injuries. He threw back his hood, and Cashin's scarred face caught the firelight. Princess, he said, and his voice broke on the word. Jasmine looked at him, this man who'd been her father's sword, who'd tried to save her, who'd survived somehow against impossible odds. She looked at him, and felt something crack in her chest that had nothing to do with rage. Is it done? He asked quietly. She held up the dagger, still slick with blood. It's done. Jaffa is dead. Malika is dead. The wolf has no head. Cashin's eyes shone with something that might have been tears. Your father would be proud. My father would have wanted me to rebuild, Jasmine said, looking back at the burning fortress. To take the throne and rule with mercy and wisdom. She paused, then smiled, that terrible, beautiful smile. But I'm not my father. I'm the ghost he left behind. And ghosts don't rule kingdoms. She dropped the dagger at her feet, letting it clatter against the cobblestones. Behind her, part of the fortress wall collapsed inward with a sound like thunder. The wolf's empire, devouring itself. Then what will you do? Cashin asked. Jasmine looked at the dawn breaking over the city, her city, freed from tyranny but scarred beyond recognition. She thought about the servants who'd bowed their heads. The rebels who'd whispered nightingale in dark alleys. The people who'd survived by bending rather than breaking. "I'll disappear," she said finally. "Let them think I died in the fire with him. Let them build something new without a blood-stained princess haunting their halls." She met Cassion's gaze. "But first, I need you to spread the word. Tell them what happened here. Tell them Jasmine of House Aldrich repaid her debts in full." She turned and walked toward the gates, toward the city waking to find its nightmare ended. The blood on her wedding gown was drying to rust, and somewhere behind her, the wolf throne finally collapsed into the flames. Princess Jasmine, last of her line, walked into the dawn and let the ashes fall where they may.